So thank you so much, Sarah. As I said, this is part of an ongoing series that the Historic Districts Council has been carrying out in the Bronx. And this is part of our Six to Celebrate program, specifically for the Bronx Borough Landmarks Committee group, which was a winner of our Six to Celebrate program for 2020. And through the Bronx Borough Landmarks Preservation Committee, we've been highlighting different areas of the Bronx. And today we are going to be talking about City Island with Sarah Eccles. Thank you so much for joining. Sarah, welcome. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise. And feel free to take it from here.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Diego. As Diego said, I'm a historic preservationist. I grew up in the Bronx. I spent a little bit of time in Ireland, where my parents are from, but I spent a good deal of my childhood and teenage years on City Island, sort of surrounded by the historic fabric and history of the island. And I think growing up surrounded by that, it was a major influence on why I became a historic preservationist. And I work in the East Village, but I spend a lot of my free time researching and advocating for preservation in the Bronx, because I feel it is a tremendously overlooked asset that we have in New York City. And City Island is such a strong representation of the history that we have here, because it's so diverse, and the architecture that you see here is just so tremendous and not something you would typically expect to see in New York City. So with that, I'm going to...
If you have any questions, please feel free to type them on the chat, and I'll make sure to share them with Sarah. Thank you.
Okay. Just to note, the island does have a few buildings that are nominated to the National Register, but since they don't do very much in ways of protection, I'm going to be focusing on New York City designated landmarks and then undesignated. So just to situate ourselves, for anyone who's unfamiliar with City Island, it's this small island circled here in red in the northeastern part of the Bronx. It's about 1.5 miles long, and it's very easy to walk it and see all of these buildings that we're going to look at. So for many people, especially people from New York City, when you talk about City Island, one of the main things you think about are all of the restaurants that serve tremendous seafood and are very busy during the summer. But to those who live there and have had the opportunity to visit, the reality is the great geographical diversity of the island and the surrounding park. To access City Island, you have to go through New York City's largest park, which is Pelham Bay Park. And the park boasts one of New York City's final remaining natural forests. And the natural vegetation here reminds us of the Lenape, who were the original inhabitants of this land. Interestingly, within Pelham Bay Park, just at the turn of the 20th century, near a popular fishing and swimming point called Jack's Rock, that little black dot there that the red line is pointing to, a native burial ground was found, and the remains were brought to the Natural History Museum. The location is now overgrown with forests, which happened when we did, Robert Moses did the infill to create Orchard Beach. And the only public attempt to acknowledge the original caretakers of this land is a trail named after a moniker given to the Lenape in conversation, the Sewanee Trail, which wasn't actually the name of the people of the Lenape that were here, something they rather called themselves. So hopefully we can work to do better to call attention to this history and the land in a public way. Since the Lenape shared this land for some time with the colonists who settled here, and they settled here peacefully for quite some time until tensions began to arise, and they finally came to a head with Keith's War. And this is the war, of course, that's responsible for Anne Hutchinson's death. And Hutchinson is the woman who lends her name to the Hutchinson River and the Hutchinson River Parkway. And about 11 years after the war, Thomas Pell is believed to have purchased the area from the Lenape in 1654. And as typically happens, settlers sectioned off parts of the land and brought up farms, And though a little bit of a spoiler, the island never developed too much, as you can see here in this right-hand photo, or the left-hand photo for you guys, from the marsh, which was taken last year. When you're standing here, you're looking back at the island and you can see you don't see many buildings. There was a man who saw this island within the Pell plot, and his name was Benjamin Palmer. He set his sights on this island and he purchased it from Pell. He sought to create a port that would rival Manhattan, naming it New City Island. Palmer was an inventive businessman. He created the Free Bridge, or the Farmers Bridge, pictured here, to rival the King's Bridge, which at the time you had to pay for. Kingsbridge also lends its name, of course, to Kingsbridge in the Bronx. His bridge, Palmer's Bridge, was free, and though everyone loved it, it didn't make any money. And like his bridge, City Island didn't turn out the way he expected, and it didn't become a port to rival Manhattan. It did, however, begin to develop quite quickly. The island's first industry was solar salt works that produced salt from evaporated seawater in the 1820s. This industry didn't take off too well, though, and the islands turned to their surrounding waters for their next industry. And though the oysters in this region had been a staple in the Lenape's diet for hundreds of years, there needed to be a better way to turn a profit from cultivating them. So a man named Orrin Fordham, a shipbuilder from Connecticut, devised a system of planting the oysters to increase the yield, and he revolutionized the business of oyster farming. Oysters were the most popular seafood in the second half of the 19th century, and nearly 100 City Island families earned a considerable living harvesting them. The next industries the island turned to was shipbuilding, and the islanders retained their connection to oyster cultivation economy by the many seafood and clam bar and oyster bars that they opened. By 1868, the farm lines in a large part were gone, and we can see the many lots that had been sold off. We can also see the clusters here of houses expanded, and by 1893, the colored pieces of the map shown on the right-hand side show larger sections of homes, including commercial buildings. The island began to thrive off of shipbuilding, oyster farming, and as a vacation spot. As the island became more populated and popular to visit, this 3-cent toll bridge pictured here was opened in 1873, connecting the island to the mainland for the first time. The station at Bardo Pell, the present-day horse stables, allowed for more streetcars, which traveled out to City Island. You can see here the horse car stopped on City Island Avenue. And we even briefly had a monorail to the island, but it didn't go very well, and there was eventually a collision with a pedestrian car, and that was the end of that. Despite the rapid increase in transportation, population, and the industrialization of the island, many of the homes I'm going to show you, both designated and not, are visible on these maps here. So let's look at all of the landmarks on the island, because we only have 5 designated New York City landmarks here. The first home is William Scofield's house. It's at 65 Scofield Street. It's a traditional Italianate style farmhouse and was constructed around 1860. It was part of William Scofield's estate. Scofield was a member of the first families to settle on City Island in 1826. This residence is an example of the Italianate style architecture that was so popular in the American house design between 1850 and 1880. It's evident across the island. We'll actually see a home later on in the presentation that is magnificently well preserved, and it has not been landmarked yet. This style is characterized by a square plan and tall windows, combined with the Greek Revival style features, such as its flat roof, its overhanging cornice, and its elaborate paired brackets under the eaves that flank the windows. The house represents a period of progress on the island when it began to transition to a suburban residential community, while the island was developing from farming to industries unique to the island, such as the shipbuilding and oyster industries that we just discussed. These industries played such important roles in the development of the island in the 19th and 20th centuries. The house's most striking feature is the veranda that runs the width of the ground floor on the main facade and on the setback addition. Here, the building is visible on the 1868 farm lines map. And this is the position of the home on City Island Avenue where it still stands, or City Island where it still stands today. This is Samuel Pell's house on City Island Avenue. And this striking home you see shortly after crossing the bridge onto City Island. It was constructed in around 1876, and it is a very fine and well-preserved example of the Second Empire style frame house that was once so popular in rural areas in New York City, but are now increasingly being altered or demolished. So we don't typically see an example of this style of architecture so well preserved. It was built for oysterman Samuel Pell. It is an example of the enormous wealth that the oyster trade brought to the community. And we will see a surviving house similar to this on the southern end of the island later in the presentation that has been greatly pared down and typical of what happens to these homes when they're left undesignated or not cared for. This is a 3-story frame building. The Pell House has its original clapboards and retains its historic windows. It has a richly embellished molded door, window surrounds, bracketed cornices, bay windows, and curved wood braces. The unusually well-preserved and elaborately detailed mansard roof retains its original patterned polychrome slate shingles and decorative metal flashing. Though this building is repeatedly cited for its special mansard roof, this particular slate design is actually seen on quite a few buildings on the island. So if you do take a stroll down City Island Avenue and you take note of this style, you'll see it repeated on many of the mansard roofs on the island. Samuel Pell, who built this house, was a descendant of the Pell family that we spoke about earlier that owned all of the surrounding land. He and his children who occupied this house until about 1900 were prominent members in the City Island family. Then in 1907, they sold this house to James Freely, who imported lace curtains. And then in the late 1920s, it passed on to his son, who was a prominent attorney and a minor shareholder in the New York Giants baseball team. And he occupied this house until 1972. So pretty incredible. There's only about 3 owners in about 100 years. And it's still currently being used as a residence. This is the home's location on the 1893 map. And then this is the home's location on the island. So you can see it's just as you come onto the island on its northern end. This is number 175 Belden Street. It is one of only a few picturesque cottages. Now, typically when you say a cottage, you think of a simple, small, inexpensive dwelling, the type that developed on City Island in the mid-19th century, as the island was a small farming maritime community. We have many cottages that still stand today. But what makes this home so special is its really decorative brackets, its dormers, its porches, and its bay that really make it a picturesque cottage, something that you'd see in a fairy tale almost. And it's stood so well preserved at the southern end of the island. And it has a tremendous view of the Pelham Bay. So you can see it here where it stands. It's just right at the edge of the water there. And there on the map. 21 Tier Street, constructed in 1896 as a summer home, believe it or not, for the size, was constructed for the politician and real estate investor Lawrence Delmore and his wife Mary Delmore. The building was designed by Samuel H. Booth, a local builder whose offices were on City Island Avenue. The structure is a rare surviving example of this shingle style, and it was an important American architectural style that really didn't become popular in New York City, but became popular in seaside towns and suburban areas. But we don't see a lot of them preserved because a lot of those areas have been so redeveloped. This home sits facing Eastchester Bay, and the house at 21 Tier Street is just quintessential shingle style. It features its shingled sides and the original turret, which you can still see from the water because there's nothing blocking it surrounding. And this house is still used as a single family residence, though I don't believe it's a summer house anymore. And this is the location on the 1897 map. And you can see there, it's really just right at the curve of the island. And this is City Island's public school, not the current one, but that's what it was called. It was constructed in 1897, and it served as the community's only school until 1931. The architect of this Georgian revival style building that was originally, still is, red brick clad, but you can't see it anymore, was C.B.J. Snyder. He was the superintendent of the school buildings in New York City from 1891 until 1923. But what makes this building very special is Snyder was developing the schools in the city, in Manhattan and Brooklyn mostly, where it was really overdeveloped and he had really small spaces to work with. So he developed a H plan for the school where the buildings had an exterior courtyards within the H. But here, since City Island was so urban or suburban, he had a little bit more room to work with. And he chose this Georgian revival style that was a little more grand and larger. And it's just really significant that it's still standing. The school was expanded in 1929, and then it was renumbered to Public School 17 in 1903. And it was designated as the City Island School in 1916. And it was eventually replaced in 1975 by PS 175, which is actually where I went when I was younger. And the original school building then began to be used by various community groups. So the City Island Historical Society and the City Island Nautical Museum and Brownies groups met there. So this is an example of an extremely historic building and beautiful and architectural, but that has continued to serve the community as the community has grown and changed. And that's one of the things that's really special about historic preservation is we keep buildings, and though it didn't function as a school anymore, it continued to be useful to the community. So we didn't have to tear it down. We could continue to use it. And part of it is condos because everything is condos. So the building was not yet constructed by the time this fire map was completed, but this is where the building would have been a year later. And this is where the building sits on City Island. So many of these landmarks are designated because of their unique characteristics compared to other structures in New York City and how they represent the development of City Island. Beyond that, there are structures here left undesignated that represent all of the above and are strikingly beautiful and carefully restored without major alterations. So the first is one of my favorite. It's number 284 City Island Avenue, and it was constructed between 1897 and 98. And this was City Island's Skyscraper. It is a 5-story building that rocked the island with fear of towering buildings. When this building went up, the islanders in 1897 began to worry about the towering heights of buildings that were going to be surrounding them. Of course, you know that didn't happen. This structure is marginally altered. It still features its original gambrel roof and Palladian window. The building's iron frame bay windows are still intact, and the building is reminiscent of larger structures we would have seen rising in Manhattan at this time. It stands on a 20-foot lot. It was used as tenements, and for a time it was the offices of Samuel S. Miller, who owned many shops on the island in the 1930s and 40s. This structure came out of the enormous wealth that the oyster trade and shipbuilding trade brought to the maritime community of City Island in the 19th century, allowing the island to almost start to take shape of the vision Benjamin Palmer had for it over 100 years prior. So this is the building 284 City Island Avenue on what was then called Main Street. And here is the building's location on City Island Avenue. This two-story wood frame house was constructed between 1869 and 1872 by William Cochran. The construction is rooted in a classic American style. Originally, both sections had a porch. Today, just one does, which you can often see the residents sitting on in the summer. William Cochran had a shoe store and boot shop that he ran on City Island and was one of the first people interred in Pelham Cemetery, Plot 1 on Hawkins Street on the island. The home later served as Gerald Ford's yacht sales, seen above, covered in buttons on Memorial Day, 1935. The house represents the commercial development of the island, like Cochran's store, where he bought the lot beside the school, which we will see on the next map. 295 City Island Avenue is a remarkable example of preservation on the main drag, with its siding, roofing, and framing all meticulously cared for. So here we can see Cochran's home right next to the school. And then there's the location of the building on the island. This is the Francis Vale estate on Paulis Place. This one was a walk to find, but it is very special. This lot was developed in the early 19th century with the present Italianate building constructed in the mid-19th century. The building features a hip roof, bracketed eaves, and a sunroom that had uninterrupted views of the water before other buildings were constructed. The estate even had its own pier to accept deliveries from the mainland. The estate gained notoriety in the early 1900s as the land had been modeled after an English garden, not unlike other homes on the island or in the surrounding Pelham Bay Park at the time, but this is one of the last remaining few. This and the Bardo Pell Mansion that still exists in Pelham Bay Park were one of the few surviving English gardens throughout the 20th century. When you walk around the surrounding grounds that would have been parceled up from this estate, you can still see the remains and some still standing great oak trees that would have been planted on the grounds. This home is an example of the development of the island from rural farming to oyster farming, an industrial area with expanding residential development, one that was profiting off of the success of emerging industries on the island. So here we can see the estate with its many access points and its little pier. And there's its location down at the water. This is 321 City Island Avenue, today referred to as Dan's parents' house by the current owner. This home is a remarkable example of civilian intervention by the community on City Island. So this is preservation here without laws or zoning. This was an islander who grew up in this home, left it, and continued to see it throughout his life and didn't want to see it razed. So the home was slated for demolition and he stepped in to save it. When rehabbing it, they retained as much of the original shiplap siding as possible. And they told me they only had to replace 17 corbels. The two-story classic structure still retains its large oriel windows, double doors, and decorative framed windows. This late 19th century home, constructed by the Levinus estate, the shipbuilders and oystermen. Joshua Levinus was not only an oysterman, but one of the earliest oystermen, and was considered the dean of oystermen on City Island. The family was so wealthy that he had a home on the corner of Scofield Street and City Island Avenue, and one block up on Prospect Street, now Carroll Street, they had a hotel and a hall. We'll see that in the maps following. So there is the house. And there is the home's location. And just one block up, this was their hotel and their hall. This is the City Island Firehouse, which has a very interesting history. So the first firehouse was constructed in 1898 after the annexation of the island into New York City. You can see that one pictured here in 1933 on the right-hand side. It was constructed of wood and it cost $8,000. They used the Trinity Methodist Church bells, which were just a little bit to the north, for the fire alarm at that time. And then today, this is a 1940 photo of the current firehouse. So then in 1939, under the Workers' Progress Administration effort for public works, the present brick structure we see was erected in a very similar fashion as the original wooden structure on the site. So the building didn't exist by the time this map was drawn, obviously, but here is where it would go, and here's its location. And this is the home that I was talking about when we looked at the William Scofield house. So this is on Pilot Street, and it is just so striking to me. It was constructed by William H. Lockwood, a shipmaker of Norwalk, on a piece of the Bone estate that he purchased in the mid-19th century. This building has been meticulously cared for over 150 years. And like the William Scofield house, the home is an Italianate style. It has a square plan, tall windows. It has Greek Revival style features, such as its flat roof, its overhanging house or cornice, and its elaborate prayer brackets. It also, like the Scofield house, has a veranda, and though this one is shorter, I think it's arguably just as striking. And it features French doors walking onto the veranda. This house represents the progress of the island during its transition from suburban to a residential community. So here is the William Lockwood estate on the 1863 map, directly across from Grace Church, which is a National Register nominated property. Listed property, actually. And then this is the location of the home. Then appearing on the maps in the late 1880s, this 3-story Second Empire style house features a widow's watch and intact dormers. Though it has lost its shingle roof and its decorative front door, it is largely intact. It's reminiscent of the Samuel Pell house constructed shortly before. And this home was constructed after the Pilot Street house, but only about 40 feet to the north. This home shows the rapid residential development of the area before we had sprawling space between homes. And though we are not getting row houses or townhouses yet, the development is getting much closer together. The industries were thriving, people were visiting the island in the summer, and many were building summer homes out here, like the 21 Tier Street home. So there in the red box, you can see 128 City Island Avenue, and actually just right here, that's 141 Pilot Street. So you can see how close in proximity they were constructed. And then that's the location on the island. So why preserve any of this? With so many historic structures and a community that appears to be taking good care of the fabric that has served them for over 150 years, you might be wondering, why is it important to landmark these historic sites? Well, we are seeing some major alterations to structures on the island, like this 1.5-story cottage that has sat near the southeast corner of City Island Avenue and what was formerly known as Crab Street since the 1890s. It hasn't been torn down, but it lost some of its most beautiful decorative elements, including its portico. So you can see by 2021, some of it had been stripped. And then in 2022, someone had purchased it and pared it way down, took off its portico and put on some gray vinyl siding. Now, we're fortunate that the tangible history of this building is still here, but we've lost some of its beauty. Another example of possible development stands in one of my personal favorite buildings on the island. This is a wood frame house, one of the oldest homes on the island, constructed by the Horton family. They were one of the original developers of the island. George Horton was responsible for the construction of 5 streets on City Island, including City Island Avenue, which at that time was called Main Street. It is actually asserted that the lobster box structure is the original home of the Hortons, though I have not found any concrete evidence of this. It's an exciting lead to follow. But this home that is sat here at 600 City Island Avenue, beside City Island's Catholic Church, went up for sale and was let sit into some decay while it was up for sale. And a sale went through last year. And though no DOB permits have been filed yet, and unless this structure becomes a landmark, all we can hope for is that the owner's intentions are to rehabilitate this building rather than tear it down and build something new. So we just have to wait and find out. Another cause for concern is the rezoning of the commercial district and surrounding areas of City Island Avenue. Many preservationists before the land loss law sought out restrictive zoning to keep their structures in their neighborhoods low and de-incentivize development. And many say that since City Island only has one way in and one way out, that development is already de-incentivized. We can't always rely on that. Things are ever changing. So the new zoning allows developers to construct a 3-story building in a relatively low scale development area. And so that really begins to change things. This corner here is one of the most built up corners in City Island's commercial district. So while 284 City Island Avenue would not be a savvy investment to tear down, since it would be difficult to get the planning permission to construct another 5-story building, the smaller scale buildings to the northern end of this skyscraper become at risk. And even the 3-story structure would be at risk for redevelopment. Beyond the rezoning, the reality is these beautiful buildings that we have looked at here are not protected, and there isn't anything besides a community, which is a strong one, stopping them from being torn down. I just want to give a special thanks to the City Island Nautical Museum and Historical Society for the images and some of the information in the presentation tonight. And this, just to note, is the shot of the City Island's newest bridge. So if anyone has any questions specifically about buildings, feel free to ask. I will note this is part of an ongoing research project that I am conducting in the Bronx on City Island. So I welcome any and all questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was very, very interesting. If any of the attendees has any question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. It was a very interesting content. I really enjoyed it. I particularly enjoyed the section where you mentioned the potential landmarks. And to me, it's very interesting that those buildings, which are very, very well preserved, are not individual landmarks. Especially the William Lockwood estate. It was incredibly beautiful, and it seems very, very well preserved. Do you have any idea as to why these buildings, which have all the merits to become an individual landmark, have not been converted into landmarks yet?
Well, I think, from reading the designation reports, one of the things that I saw repeatedly in the designation reports is, for instance, the Samuel Pell House. They note that the Second Empire style is an extremely rare style to see so well preserved. And they note that the Samuel Pell home is one of 13 well-preserved buildings in that style on City Island. And this is just the best example that they have. So the language in the designation reports produced by the Landmarks Preservation Commission would lead me to believe that they absolutely acknowledge the amount of historic property out here that has been so well cared for, and they just are starting with the number one best preserved one that nobody could argue against, and potentially going to work their way down, but you know, we can't rely on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Carol.
Yeah,
Yes,
hi.
Carol?
Hi, Diego and Sarah. I wonder, can you speak, Sarah, to the degree to which there's any kind of local advocacy or interest among the, various organizations on City Island, or if there's been any approaching elected officials with regard to the importance of landmarking some of the buildings you've pointed out? I agree with you that they're really worthy, but of course, Landmarks has, lots of entities knocking on its door about designation, and it's always helpful to have a kind of grassroots or other kind of local support, as well as, in particular, the local council member has to be in favor to make it work.
Yeah. I would say that the City Island Historical Society does a very good job in cataloging its history to its preservation. I think it has been so well done by the community. I don't know if it's really at the forefront of what they see as an issue. I spoke to some community members who see this being an issue, as some of the people who are really caring about the island and its history are starting to age out of the ability to do a lot for it.
Right.
So, there are people who have been there, since the 60s, and they know, they're like an encyclopedia about the place. And I think the duty in a way is kind of falling on people like me now, who can go out and start knocking on doors and take this information that they all know and try and get LPC to listen and look more towards the Bronx.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I do really emphasize that once there is a kind of a group that has a voice, getting the local council member on board is absolutely vital.
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
Yeah. If anyone else has a question, please feel free to unmute yourself. If not, I think we're going to conclude our meeting. And thank you again, Sarah. This was a really wonderful conversation. I think all the information that you shared is going to be very useful for us to, reach out to the LPC and show them all the potential for designation that there is in City Island, and also to educate people from the Bronx and from all over the city about City Island. It's a very beautiful place that doesn't get the spotlight that it deserves. So
if anybody has any questions, I'm going to put my email in the chat, and if you'd like any primary sources, any more information about the buildings or the Lenape history on the island, feel free and I can send it out to you. Or any questions about Bronx preservation in general. I do a lot of this work on my own time for fun. It's very interesting to me, so happy to help. There we go, it's in the chat.
thank you so much. Yeah, that was a really outstanding presentation. Agree.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone who attended. Please make sure to keep checking our upcoming conversations and events. I'm hoping that soon we're going to start doing in-person walking tours again and meetings. So I'll be sharing that with everyone. And thank you again for joining.
Thank you so much, everybody.